Okay, so good morning. It's great to have all of you here. My name is Aracha Chatrakulnayutaya. I am one of the assistant deans for Equalities and Diversity at Birkbeck. I am based at the School of Business, Economics, and Informatics. Along with my fellow assistant dean for equality, we are really glad you are here to join us for this event today. May I quickly just invite all my fellow assistant deans to introduce themselves, if that's okay. Can I start with Professor Daniel Monk, please? Thank you.
Hi, hello everybody. Thank you, Varacha, for chairing this event. It's really great to see people here. Really excited to have this opportunity to bring everyone together. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I invite Dr. Catherine Thompson, who is the Assistant Dean for Equality in the School of Science, to introduce herself, please. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Sharata. Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm AD of Equalities in Science. It's really great to see so many people at this event. I look forward to it. Thank you, Aracha.
Thank you. I believe we currently our other colleagues, Dr. Isabel and Dr. Kalpana Wilson are not here at the moment. I think they have potentially clashing meetings, but they have also helped with the organization of this event. So I just want to acknowledge that. So could I now just get everyone just to sit back and relax, and I will just talk us through some housekeepings, if that's okay, in terms of how this event will go. So right now, this is the schedule. We've got welcome and introduction to our speakers. Shortly, I'm going to introduce you all to Dr. Joyce Mamode, who is going to be our keynote speaker from 11:05 to 11:35. And then from 11:35 to 12:25, we're going to have our panel discussion with representatives from the 5 staff networks, and that's REACH, Astrea, Staff Disability Network, Parents Network, and Out at Birkbeck. And Dr. Joyce Mamode will also be joining us for the panel discussion. So we will then aim to take questions, have some discussions with everyone who is here today, and then we aim to close at 12:30. I hope that sounds okay with everyone. All right, so before we get started, just want to quickly remind everybody of some of the principles that we aim to adhere to, and we ask that you also observe these principles. We aim to operate a principled space today, which has been based on the work of the Building the Anti-Racist Classroom Collective. So full acknowledgement for the BARC Collective for introducing the principled space as guiding principles for what we're doing today. I'm going to leave the slide up because of the tight schedule that we have. I would like to ask everybody here to observe these principles. And the main one is the one that is highlighted in yellow below, which is experiences that are shared today may be deeply personal and should be treated as confidential. And what is being talked about stays in this place. We ask that you do not share or action anything that you hear today unless explicit consent is given by the person sharing their story. And I hope that you can respect this request. So that's it. Thank you so much for letting me just talk you through the principled space very briefly. I'm going to put the link for the website that will take you to the principled space principles by the BARC Collective in the chat shortly. But for now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Joyce Mamode, who is our keynote speaker. Joyce is an associate tutor at Birkbeck in the Department of Organizational Psychology. She's also a postdoctoral researcher working on an ESRC-funded project, Buying Social Justice Through Procurement, based at Queen Mary University of London. Joyce holds a PhD from Warwick Business School, an MSc in Occupational Psychology from Birkbeck, and a BSc in Psychology from Newcastle University. Prior to taking up this research position, Joyce was the head of assisted Transport for London, and she was responsible for developing new strategic approaches to transport provision for older and disabled Londoners who face barriers to using public transport. Before joining TFL, initially as an inaugural member of the TFL board, Joyce was a researcher for a major trade union, the Transport and General Workers Union, which is now part of Unite. So I'd like to welcome Joyce as our keynote. I'm going to put my mic on mute now, and I will stop sharing my slides so that Joyce can share her slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuracha. I'm going to try and share my screen, I think, because I'm not sure. I think that might be the better way. Let me see. Here we go. So thank you very much for that introduction. It saves me having to introduce myself. So you know all about me and my background. What I'm going to be doing today is talking to you about research that I conducted for my PhD that looked into employee voice in organisational equality and diversity and inclusion work. So my research focused particularly on employee voice through trade unions, but my findings, together with a consideration of the broader equality initiatives that trade unions as organisations have introduced internally, I think might be useful in terms of staff network groups and what would make them successful and where they might go in the future. So when I started thinking about what I was going to say in this presentation, I thought it might be useful to start by stepping back for a moment or two and just thinking about what our goals are, what's our mission here, what is it we're trying to do if we're trying to make equality, diversity and inclusion meaningful at work. So I thought I'd start by thinking about something that Hock and Noon, a couple of researchers, came up with a few years ago, and they talked about this idea of an empty shell equality policy. So what they meant there was you can often look around, lots of organisations have statements about their intent on being very, committed to equality, committed to diversity, etc. They're very good statements of intent, but they lack often, when you look behind them, any actual practices or substance or deep degree of substance to what they're actually going to deliver based on the words that they're professing. So you can think of equality policies and practices in organisations as sitting on a continuum with empty shell pronouncements at one end of the continuum and increasing levels of substance as you move along the continuum, with greater thought of an effort being put into the accompanying practices and initiatives as you move along. So one of the things I think it's useful to start is thinking about what moving along that continuum looks like. So obviously having the statement of what you want to do is quite important, but sometimes these statements are very vague. So one of the steps along that continuum is having very clear objectives. The next is that how are you going to review practice? How are you going to revise your initiatives? And how are you going to identify new initiatives in response to the issues that you might be highlighting? So that's where we want to be going, along that continuum. So the next thing I want to think about is what are the things that help move along that continuum? So there are various forces that come into play in organisations that can help build the case for change. The first one being legislative requirements. And we're all familiar with those, the Equality Act, the public sector equality duty within that Act, even though some of its provisions have been watered down somewhat. They're still important impetuses for organisations to think about what they want to do in terms of equality policy, practice and initiatives. Gender pay reporting, of course, has been a big impetus in terms of at least monitoring gender pay, if not necessarily actually bringing into play things to address the issues that those figures might be highlighting. So that's just one aspect of the kind of impetus for change, but legislation on its own is never enough. What it tends to do is create enough pressure to almost form kind of tick box exercise activities where organisations feel they're meeting their legal obligations, but you know, how much substance is there behind it really? It's not, sometimes not really more than just meeting the basic requirements of the law. Indeed, it has been noted that in some cases organisations are happy to kind of fall foul of legislation because penalties for breaching a lot of these legislative requirements are not that heavy. So, for example, you might, as an employer, decide it's a price worth paying to take a case, to have a case brought against you under the Equality Act, lose it, pay compensation, and on its own, that's not necessarily enough to give you the motivation to actually change what you're doing. This is where the second kind of pressure for change comes in, and that's this idea of internal organisational imperatives. So these can, in that example that I gave you about disability, the big one there would be the reputational issues. So yes, you could pay the fine if someone's taken you to court over kind of outrageous equality breach, let's say to do with disability or something like that. But the reputation of the organisation is in danger of suffering as a result of it. So there are other factors that come into play that put pressure on organisations to try and create some change based, you know, that come from legislative kind of minimum standards, but they want to go further because they want to have good reputations as organisations that respect the ideals of equality, diversity and inclusion. Other things that come under this category are things like charter marks and awards. So organisations typically want to have those lovely logos at the bottom of their websites. They want to say that they are disability confident employer, that they have Athena Swan level whatever, etc., etc. So these create internal pressures within the organisation to want to do something in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion. But again, there's a danger that they go so far and no further. I don't know if anyone here has been involved in working on charter marks, but they are intrinsically kind of tick box exercises to some extent. Sometimes they will go a little bit further, but you know, you could, on their own, they don't necessarily create enough impetus for real substantial change in an organisation that really deals with some of the kind of really deep-seated structural issues that we're talking about when we're thinking about equality, diversity and inclusion. The other thing I've put there is labour market pressures, and that used to be, you know, 20 plus years ago, it was a big issue about getting women into certain areas of organisations because there was this perceived forthcoming time bomb, demographic time bomb. You could argue we might be entering a phase where those kinds of things are becoming important again. So those are some of the pressures that come from within the organisation. But again, as I say, they're not in themselves enough. The missing third factor that really can make a difference in bringing these other two pressure areas to bear in creating real change is that of stakeholder influences. And alongside the trade union influence, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about, staff network groups are another complementary and important influence that can be in this dynamic within organisations to help pressurise for real substantive change in terms of what the organisation is doing in terms of its equality, diversity and inclusion practice. So that's where my research comes in, really. What I looked at in my research was the trade union input here. So I looked at a particular relatively new actor within trade unions that is particularly focused on improving this influence within organisations, and that is the trade union equality representative. They have been around for a while, but they're relatively new in respect of most of the other roles that we're familiar with within trade unions. So just a little bit about who equality reps are. It's a voluntary role. People from within the membership at a workforce can put themselves forward and go up for election to the equality rep role. And the idea of it is that it provides a specific and specialised focus on equality matters at very much at a workplace level. There's two aspects to it: to support and advise members on their own equality issues, potentially not to represent them, because that would be the role of a caseworker or a shop steward, but to advise and provide a kind of equality lens, equality focus, to help both the member, perhaps if they're nervous about raising an issue, they know an equality rep is more likely to be a sympathetic voice, a sympathetic ear, sorry, but also in terms of helping and advising fellow workplace representatives, for example, shop stewards and safety reps, who might not have the expert knowledge about equality issues, or necessarily a particular passion for equality. And the idea is they work together as a team with the equality rep, bringing this particular focus. Now, equality reps came onto the scene into union structures as a way to supplement the internal structures that unions already had in place, that have been in place for many, many years. And I'll just say a little bit about them because the dynamic between them is quite important. So you may or may not be aware, I'm sure most of you are, that unions have their own internal equality structures as part of their democratic structural processes. Just as an aside, unions are quite interesting as organisations because they are probably the only example of a truly democratic organisation as such. I know they're not often portrayed as this, but they have everything a union does is basically decided in a democratic way. They have very complex rule books and structures through which members or their representatives are making decisions throughout the kind of process and throughout the levels. So it was realised quite a few years ago that there needed to be more of an input from underrepresented groups into these democratic structures. So many unions have both formal and informal groups and networks within the union structure that enable this to happen. And this is just an example. Some figures here on the kind of level of and types of these networks. Now these operate within the union itself, and the problem they found was getting the excellent work, the policies that were being developed by these structures into individual workplaces, because the people involved in these networks and groups, whether formal or informal, weren't necessarily represented at every workplace. So hence the idea of the equality rep came into being, because they would be kept aware of the policies and initiatives and campaigns that were being set by these democratic structures across the whole union, take them to individual workplaces, promote them, make sure people were aware of them, and try and ensure that they were being enacted by local workplace representatives. So what I did in my research was look to see how successful equality reps were in that aim, but also in how successful they were being at what is known within industrial relations as renewal and revitalisation. So in terms of helping to encourage new groups of people to come into trade unions, that would be renewal, and how useful and successful they were being in helping, as I said just a moment ago, about helping to bring this equality agenda that's quite progressive within unions, that's being set at national level, bringing it to individual workplaces and getting it on that local trade union agenda so that issues could be raised with organisations individually. So I also wanted to understand what helped equality reps have an influence at that local level, and how that influence might be being wielded, because equality reps don't have any role in the kind of formal collective bargaining and consultation mechanisms that are familiarly used by trade unions. So they're kind of on their own in that sense. They don't have this formal role. So what was it that they were doing? If they were able to have an influence, what was it that they were doing? So on the right, there's just a quick review of where I got my data from. Interviews with union officials, TUC officials, and equality reps themselves. Documents from unions talking about the role and what they wanted, what they were doing, and also a survey that I circulated to over 3,000 equality reps and got about a 10% response rate. So what did I find? So I found, firstly, that the role was successful. It was successfully helping to renew local trade union membership, and also, most importantly, that it was able to be encouraging new groups of people to become active in their unions. So amongst equality reps, there was quite a broad diversity in terms of the identities that I've got listed there on the left. The proportions of women, visible ethnic minorities, LGBT, people who identified as being disabled were much higher than you would find amongst standard equality reps in terms of something like a shop steward role or a health and safety rep. So there was definitely an element to which that having something specifically aimed at equality was helping to encourage people to come into activity that hadn't previously done so. But it's also interesting because alongside those people, there was around a third of equality reps who didn't identify with any of those identity groups. So they were, you might say, not members of an underrepresented or minority group, but they were still passionate about equality and wanted to try and make a difference in this area at the workplace. The role was also helping encourage and give confidence to those people once they came into the role, and 60% of them were actually, that was the first role they'd ever done in the union. They then were going on to become shop stewards and health and safety reps. So there was a kind of a succession of people then coming through the union. And I noticed recently one of the people that I interviewed for my research is now on one of the kind of top level decision-making bodies of her union. So that's good to see that that's continued. Not only have they become shop stewards, but they're going on to quite senior roles within the democratic structures of unions. So there's definitely that idea of renewal. In terms of revitalisation, getting equality on the agenda, there were things that were helping do that by the nature of the people who were equality reps themselves. So they were a diverse group of people. They were going on to become shop stewards and health and safety reps. So just by doing that, they were bringing the equality agenda into the mainstream of trade union activity. But as well as that, there was this dimension to do with allyship, which is something that has come to the fore most recently during the Black Lives Matter campaigns a couple of years ago. Really, people talking a lot about allyship. And this was really somewhat to do with the 34% who didn't see themselves as belonging to any kind of minority group. But also the fact that because equality reps are asked to cover all the equality strands in what they do, there was a dimension of allyship being created between people who didn't necessarily belong to a particular minority, but were becoming, through their discussions as equality reps as a group, became familiar with the issues of other groups, identified that within a broader idea of equality issues, and were then able to become allies to those other groups. And that's quite a powerful thing because they can be advocates often in spaces. And I think we would all know what we mean by, if we don't belong to a particular minority group, we can often hear things that people who are not particularly supportive of equality might not say in front of those people, but they might say to us thinking we're not in that group. And it gives a really powerful way of being able to challenge discrimination and unacceptable views and things, because they're going to be revealed to people who don't necessarily, you know, are not seen as belonging to that group. And it's a very powerful thing as well, I think, to be able to bring that kind of intervention in. So anyway, so there was this dimension of allyship. So that was quite an important element as well. So I also asked through the survey the kinds of impacts they were having on various areas of equality. And just to back up that idea of allyship, you can see that within all these 6 areas that I asked about, the equality reps were reporting impacts across strands. And if you look on the right there, that they were having impacts in multiple areas. So they were exhibiting this kind of allyship across equality strands, whether or not they personally identified with those areas themselves. So all very positive, I think. So less positive was that finding at the bottom right there, that there was 20% of equality reps who weren't having any impact anywhere. So what this gave me was an opportunity to do some statistical analysis to see what the factors were that determined whether equality reps were able to have impact versus those weren't able to report having any impact. And that was quite illuminating in itself. So this highlighted a number of significant factors that I think are quite useful to consider in terms of our discussion today. So here are the kind of main factors that came out. Spending time helping and advising members was quite a powerful factor. If an equality rep was doing that, they were more likely to say they were having an influence over their employers' equality practices. Spending sufficient time on their equality representative work was also very important. Attending an employees' equality committee was really important. Where one existed, they didn't always exist. Regular contact with managers at least once a month came out quite very strongly as an important factor. And the last 2 factors I've got there are more to do with specific equality strands. So as well as there being this impact across all strands, for some equality strands and some issues, there was still an element of increased impact by being a member of that group. And I think from the interview data that I had, this was relating to people being able to be more aware of the particular issues that a particular group might face, that perhaps even taking into account allyship, you had to, you know, there was an added factor from actually experiencing those things yourself. So identifying as a visible ethnic minority was important in terms of race equality and religion and belief equality practices, and identifying as LGBT was a significant factor in relation to sexual orientation equality practices and gender equality as well. So interesting factors that came out there. And hang on a sec, if I can. Here we go. So using my qualitative data, I was able to look at what the mechanisms behind this and surmise some of them. Some of these are relevant to the discussion on staff network groups, and some of them aren't. So really just in summation of what I found in terms of mechanisms, the fact that equality reps were helping members and talking to them and advising them about equality issues was giving them knowledge of actual things that were wrong at the workplace, that they were able to then draw upon to identify what things might need to be improved. Alongside that, they had, for managers and the organisation, there was a perception that equality reps were carrying expert knowledge about equality. So they had a certain kudos relating to that perception of expert knowledge, particularly amongst line managers and people sort of in the lower down the managerial hierarchy, who sometimes knew nothing whatsoever about equality at all. So these things led into an ability for equality reps to really influence organisational actors like line managers, HR practitioners, occupational health practitioners, two levels, a lower level, which was more about individual cases, which isn't really that relevant for staff network groups because they don't really get involved in advocacy in relation to individual cases. That is something that is the remit of the trade union. But interestingly, is this higher level of influence that equality reps, through things like being part of equality committees and things like that, they would be sitting at the table with quite senior people who might be equality and diversity champions within that senior executive team, and they were able to informally talk to them, raise examples based on the helping members thing, confidentially, of course, not discussing people individually, but using that knowledge and those examples as data, I suppose you could call it, which they were able to then persuade managers at quite senior levels of things they could do to improve equality practice. And they were talking to people who themselves were already committed to equality and diversity improvement. So that's the kind of key thing. When I talk about an alliance, what I mean is you're finding people who themselves want to make a difference here, and on an almost individual level, asking them to champion these things at the level that they're able to have an influence. And that expert knowledge came from, that I talked about just a minute ago, came from equality reps who would network with each other and build knowledge of what other people had done that worked. And then that was a lot of where they got some of the examples from that they would try and promote at the higher level. Coupled with, of course, the policies that the union had come up with through their own equality structures. So, drawing to a close now, what lessons can we draw from all this in terms of thinking about staff network groups, how they can develop and grow, what might work? I'd be interested to hear in the second part of this whether this chimes with the experiences that the staff network groups at Birkbeck have had in recent times. So I think there are individual and organisational level lessons here. There are things to do with developing the capacity from within groups of people themselves, people who might become active within staff network groups. There's an important role for things in organisations that can attract people from underrepresented groups to participate, to feel included. The equality rep was an example of within the union how people could get themselves more involved in things, but obviously staff network groups can also have that function within an organisational context. There's a great value of sharing and discussing experiences. For union reps, it's about the cases that they might deal with more than anything, but in a staff network group, it's about sharing and discussing with each other, giving insight into what issues are, and also validation of some of those experiences. I think that can be very important. There's a confidence building function. The union rep, the equality rep had a confidence building element to it, and this opportunity for allyship. And I think that's something maybe staff network groups can think about in future. I'd be interested to see how much that goes on here. I'm not fully aware of the things you've been doing. I'm looking forward to hearing about that, about sharing across groups. What works in one area might work in another, and kind of building that alliance for change. Organisationally, time and resources are important, and I'm sure that's important for people involved in staff network groups as much as it was for the equality reps. The importance of having a seat at the table at those formal equality committees, that really was important, because as well as being directly there when decisions and discussions are taking place, it gives you that ability to create those alliances with the higher level alliances. And those alliances are themselves extremely important, because those senior managers who would be sympathetic and want to champion change, it gives them sometimes the ammunition or the information they need as to exactly what are the experiences going on in their organisation that they might not be directly experiencing themselves at the level that they're working at. And really it was one of the most powerful ways that equality reps were able to influence their organisations. I will stop there because I have gone on slightly past my time. If you're interested in the research, I have got a report that I've recently finished, and if you want to drop me an email, I'll happily send you a copy. There's lots more in there about all the things equality reps get up to, and more detail on the factors that are important. But I shall leave it there. Look forward to having any questions, and also to hearing from what the staff network groups at Birkbeck have been doing, as well as contributing to looking to the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Can I invite everyone just to clap for Joyce, either using the reaction function, or if you are able to come on screen and unmute your mic, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your insights with us, which I think resonates with a lot of the thinking and conversations that the Assistant Deans for Equalities have been having, and also the staff networks will be, I'm sure, touching upon in our next session. May I ask people who are here today, if you have any questions for Joyce, please can you just put them down in the chat function for now? And then we can do the questions after the panel discussion, if that is okay with everyone. If just in the interest of time, it would be good to get started with the panel discussion, because we have representatives from 5 wonderful staff networks here with us today, and Joyce will be joining the panel discussion as well. So do leave your questions in the chat for now, and we'll come back to them. Hope that works with everyone. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just stop the recording now.